Before we wrap up, I'd like to discuss Trump's policies toward both Greenland and Ukraine. So the former is, as we now know, is a territory which is abundant in both critical minerals but also in oil. So it's sort of a key symbol of what we've just analyzed in terms of a sort of green-brown synthesis, like both green and fossil in contemporary capitalism. Following the recent critical minerals deal between the US and Ukraine, you published an article in the Financial Times highlighting how such agreements are part of a broader global trend. So last year, the EU signed a similar deal with Rwanda, while the government of the DR Congo has proposed a critical minerals agreement with the US, which was modeled on the Ukraine deal. So how do you explain this growing trend? And specifically in the case of Ukraine, what makes its critical minerals so strategically important?
Yeah, it's great because I think we see a couple of different patterns and developments coming together and also clashing a little bit in the developments that you just laid out, or in the current events kind of that you just laid out. One is a maybe provocative but hopefully interesting claim I want to make, which is that despite appearances, there is a real through line between onshoring, which, as I just said, took form under Trump 1 and Biden's government, this critical minerals and overall supply chain onshoring, between onshoring and threatening sovereign countries, threatening or bullying them, soft and hard power, to gain access to their critical minerals, right? So we've seen this in Greenland, in Ukraine, in Canada, in divergent ways, right? Because sometimes it's a threat to invade, other times it's let's make a deal. But regardless, you are going after the deposits of sovereign nations that are outside of your territorial borders. So it almost seems like the opposite of onshoring. Onshoring is bringing in, this is a kind of more outward and obviously harkens back to a classical form of imperialism, right? But I think that there's a through line, and I think that sometimes it's Trump saying the quiet part out loud. So what I mean by that is, the Biden government, the State Department under the Biden government, actually was pressuring Greenland quite a bit to ensure that its mineral deposits went towards the West or US corporations and not China. And they were actually kind of partly successful in that lobbying, including changing a particular transaction so that a deposit was sold to a Western company and not to a Chinese one, right? So some of it is, but we didn't know about it. I mean, meaning literally, there wasn't really reporting on this so much at the time. It's after the fact, I, as a sort of expert on this, had learned that what Trump is doing super bellicose, super intensely with threats of invasion were done more quietly, maybe even more savvily by the Biden government, right? So I think that's one important thing to note, one important way that we can see the continuity. But another is that, there are two ways to onshore. We usually think of the first way, which is bring stuff within the borders. A second way, that again goes back to that classical imperial mode, is expand the borders. So your borders now encompass Greenland, or your borders now encompass Canada. We annex, right? And that annexation, classical mode of imperialism, and what does that do? It makes the borders of the state larger because the jurisdiction of the imperial capital or the imperial core now has more territory underneath it, right? And so I think that it's a slippery slope with onshoring, and I don't want to impugn all ideas about supply chain diversification or changing the location of supply chains. I'm not against that, and I'm absolutely not some proponent of free trade, whatever that might mean, right? But it is to say that once you start talking about privileged access to resources, that your corporations or your state agencies get to have this type of access, and one way to do it is have it nearby, and another is to say we're taking over the country where it happens. And so I think that there is, or we're bullying a war-torn country like Ukraine into handing over mineral wealth. And so I think that that is an uncomfortable thing to maybe think about for proponents of onshoring who are dead set against what Trump is doing. But there's a logical thread there that I think is important. The just final thing I want to say, because it's important to note, especially for those who don't work on resource sectors and maybe don't know what I'm about to say, which is, I think what Ukraine and Greenland also reveal is just how deeply speculative resource political economies are. And not just in the financial sense, but that too, very much that too, but also just in the sense of what is actually underground and how do we get at it? And how big is that reserve and how feasible and economically viable is it to extract? There's a lot of assumptions, there's a lot of probabilistic statements, okay, a 90% proven reserve, this type of thing. I like Brett Christopher's term for this, that deposits are actually not just some kind of scientific category. They are narrations of the future, he calls them. Narrations of, we're pretty sure that this deposit will yield this amount of minerals and therefore yield this amount of profits, which helps us get the investment. That's why we need the narration of the future, is to attract investors. So there's really a dense, multi-layered speculative aspect to resource political economies. And I say that with Greenland and Ukraine because their resources are undeveloped. Like, we don't actually know like how easy it will be, how much there is. Some of this stuff in Ukraine relies on Soviet era surveying that has not been updated more recently. Greenland, we've known these deposits, they've known these deposits, but very few projects have proceeded for a variety of reasons, including in some cases local opposition. So it's not at all clear that there's like an easy to trigger like resource abundant economy in either of these places. There's a lot of crucibles that will need to be passed through in order for these resources to really be developed. But, you know, with a stroke of a pen or with just an infographic or a map, you know, put up beside him, Trump and his government can just say, lots of resources there, let's get them. Themselves almost oddly enough playing into the speculative narration of the future, right? Which, you know, it shows how such governmental pronouncements might actually be key to future financing. But it's not because we actually know with verified kind of certainty that these resources are easy to access or exactly what their quantities are.
Especially in case of Ukraine, where we rely on Soviet surveys.
Absolutely. Right? And where, you know, again, the non-insignificant deposits, you know, a number of these deposits are actually in currently Russian-controlled areas, which is then not unrelated to Putin saying, I'll cut you a better deal. We'll get you Russia's minerals, like to Trump, and the ones that we control in the Ukraine territory that we control, right? So we also see how these speculative narrations of the future can actually get imbricated with escalatory geopolitical tactics, right? And can be it's quite felicitous that there's speculation because you can make a move because no one really knows.